Hello YouTube, this is Jesse Ferguson, Canadian folk musician and singer-songwriter, otherwise known as the Bard of Cornwall here on YouTube. And I'd like to talk to you today briefly about a concept in music theory which is learning music by ear, with your ear, and what exactly that means. Now, I'm not a trained musician, which is sort of the point. I guess I'm somewhat of an expert on music by ear because I'm a practitioner of it, but other than that, I'm not an expert on music theory in any way. So, music by ear, essentially, well, I'll get into a bit more detail in terms of the different definitions of it that people might use, but essentially it means learning music without any kind of formal notation being consulted, some sort of musical notation. And in terms of the history of music, it undoubtedly would be the oldest form of transmission of music. And indeed, many world cultures today still have classical music traditions, whether that's in parts of Asia or so on, that still rely exclusively or mostly on transmission by ear. So it's not written down with any kind of musical notation, and you actually learn by hearing other musicians perform the music, and you pick it up as they go along. And some anthropologists, some historians, believe that music transmission by ear is probably older than language itself. You can imagine, early human beings sitting around a campfire and sort of moaning songs and things like that. It wouldn't sound much like what we call music today probably, but banging on bones, banging on drums that they would make and singing along. Now obviously they wouldn't have any musical notation for that. It would all just be passed along, largely improvised, but I'm sure over time they would develop patterns that people would play. And so on. So in other words, you're participating, if you play music by ear, in a very long tradition, sort of essential part of human culture, the passing on of music and songs and so on. So it can be quite a rewarding and enriching experience to do, even if you are a formally trained musician, which I'm not. So the definitions, I think they're used somewhat loosely by a lot of people, including myself, depending on whom I'm talking to. Someone says, well, are you a trained musician? And sometimes I will respond, not really, I play by ear, or I'm self-taught. Now those terms can sometimes be used interchangeably by people if they're using the terms in a loose sense. Self-taught versus playing by ear. Now I do some genuine playing by ear, but I am also not truly self-taught because my father taught me some very basic chords on the guitar. So thanks, Dad. But most of what I know on various instruments that I play, including the mandolin, harmonicas, penny whistles, violin, various forms of percussion, I've picked them up mostly on my own by listening to recordings of other people, watching YouTube videos, especially sitting in with other musicians as they play their instruments. So that would be a true by ear method of learning, watching someone else play and trying to replicate that myself. But generally speaking, as we said, the official definition of by ear music would be not consulting any form of musical notation. So not reading formal notation, not consulting tablatures for guitar, tablature charts, or any kind of chord sheets or things like that. So admittedly, a lot of what I've done and songs that I've learned are not by ear. I've consulted chord charts on the internet, things like that. But the more you practice as a musician, and I've been playing music for at least 20 years now, the easier it becomes to pick things up by ear. So I can hear a recording, listen to it a few times, and I can figure out the chord structure for it with simple music, folk music, rock and roll, pop music, and things like that. So that would be true by ear learning. Now some purists would say, well, it's not by ear if you're listening to a recording, it should be in person, something like that. Like, for instance, the tradition of folk music, some people would insist that you have to actually be face-to-face in a jam-type session situation or a ceilidh, learning from another musician, not by a recording or something like that you can go back home and consult, which explains partly the diversity that you get in folk music, where someone might hear a jig or a reel played on fiddle in the pub, come home and try to figure it out, and they get the basic structure of it, but the little embellishments are all unique in their own. And that's sort of how folk music can develop organically that way. So some people will use the term by ear learning as that they don't have any formal music training, which I don't either. So it can be used in a confusing way, but technically it means you're listening with your ear and figuring out how to play it, either watching someone else, do the chords on the guitar or whatever instrument you're playing, and then try to replicate that yourself. So technically, a lot of the time it would actually be by eye as well. You're watching someone else do the structure, play the instrument, or sing it even, and you would imitate that in some way. Not unlike a lot of animals. In the animal kingdom, you think of birds, for instance, can pick up songs from their parents. They just listen and they can internalize that melody structure, and all of a sudden that bird can sing that song, or parrots can imitate music of various kinds and so on. So it seems to be hardwired into our brains as humans anyway, that's how we pick up songs and we can transmit them. And some people, like myself, seem to have a huge capacity for remembering song lyrics and chords and things like that. I must know, not to brag or anything like that, but to play probably about 300, 400 songs from various traditions, so I'm lucky that way. I wish I could apply that brain power to other things that would make me advance my career in some way. But and nevertheless, I'm happy to have that ability, and it just seems to be a natural skill that a lot of people have. So, what are some techniques that you can do if you want to develop the by ear ability, which is a good ability to have, even in addition to the ability to read formal notation. Like in the Suzuki method of classical music, there is a great emphasis also on learning by ear. Not that I'm trained in that, but I'm aware that it's a very prestigious method for teaching music. And it insists that in addition to learning music theory, beats and notes and measures and all that material, that you can actually hear a sound and reproduce it and recognize the structures of music with your intuition, with your gut almost. So, if I want to learn a song and I, for instance, can't find the chords online or something like that, or the ones that I find online don't seem to be right, well, how do I figure out the song? Well, a lot of it is just trial and error. And the more songs you play, and the longer you play it, the more you'll realize how easy it is to figure out the structure for a folk song, for instance, in the Irish or Scottish or English traditions or things like that. Old country music, rock and roll and so on. The structures are very predictable. Once you play 10 of them, you can figure out how the 11th will go. At least with a lot of practice you can. And especially with folk music, you're not insisting, you're not really worried about getting the exact same structure as somebody else perhaps, because folk music is intended to be somewhat organic. You put your own little spin on it, get the essentials of what a song sounds like, and then modify it somewhat to fit your vocal range or the instrument you're playing, something like that. So some people really insist, if they're, say, covering a big band like the Beatles or something, that it gets exactly the timing and the chord structure and this and that. I've never been one for that. I always sort of play fast and loose with the structures that I've handed to me, as long as people can recognize it as that. I'm not interested in making it sound like a recording, otherwise just go listen to the recording. Not to say there isn't some skill involved in reproducing that kind of sound, it's just not for me. So I'm a by-ear learner in that way. I stress the heart of the song. What else can you do? Well, for one thing, you can try to train your ear somewhat. It's not the same as ear training, which means recognizing pitches and being able to, say, sight read a piece of music and to sing a melody just by the notation, although it's related to by-ear music. But nevertheless, you can train your ear to pick up pitches and be more on note, on pitch, by, say, tuning your instrument first, just by ear, and then use your digital tuner. You can also use a metronome, like the one that I have up on my bookshelf. Things like that can help, refine your timing and your pitch, so that whenever you're figuring out a song or trying to play along in a jam session type thing, that you can improvise and learn something by ear that way. And it has its advantages, learning music by ear and practicing that skill, figuring out songs just by listening to it with your instrument. Because a lot of song books, even books that are printed by reputable publishers like Walton's, I have these two, one Irish and one Scottish one, songbooks, and they have about 100 ballads in each one. And they're great books, but they have a lot of mistakes, at least according to how I've heard these songs played by bands like the Dubliners and the Corries and the Chieftains and so on, and the Clancy Brothers. Anyway, I mean, for one thing, they may be working off a different version of the ballad, but there are a lot of mistakes anyway, it seems to me, in typos and things like that. So if you know how to figure out songs by ear, you can correct those typos. Sometimes you can even simplify the progressions that they put down for the chords, make it easier to play. So it has its advantages that way.